So why would we be interested in measuring dry matter in our pastures? Well, if we are managing the feed of our animals, we're going to have some sort of ration for them, and we develop rations typically on dry matter. So we are going to want to know how much feed is out there. And if we're developing a ration, we would also pull a quality sample from time to time to know what nutrients were in there. We may want to create a pasture feed inventory. So many of us, especially in the second half of the year or in spring, we might be really flush with a lot of forage in our pastures, or we might be worried that, boy, it's getting dry, we're going to start to run out. Maybe I should start rationing or come up with a strategy to make my pastures last longer. And so if we did a inventory of how much dry matter is in our pastures, we could do a better job of planning for that. We might use information on the amount of dry matter to help decide animal residence times. I think Larry is one person who does this, and I think he's going to talk about that later in the meeting. But if we know how much is out there, what our animals would eat in a day, the size of the paddock, we can do the math and figure out how long we're going to want to leave those animals in there before we move them out, so that both the animal gets the nutrition that it needs and the pasture is not overconsumed or overgrazed. Which is the fourth point there. We want to help avoid overgrazing. So if we measure the amount of residue, it might help us get off that paddock in a timely way. And we may also be interested in trying to predict or plan for performance. So if we have animals that are growing, we're going to want to make sure they're getting enough to meet our target growth rate. And if we are milking the animals, as in the picture here, we may be quite interested in making sure that they have as much intake as possible and quality, so that we get what we want. And if we measure the dry matter in there in each pasture, we will be able to achieve that. So we'll be talking, or I'll be talking about two different means of measuring dry matter. One is a rising plate meter. So if we look in the lower right here, we can see a rising plate meter, which is just basically an instrument with a lot of little marks on it here, and a computer that's kind of attached to that to a plate, and the plate rises up. So this instrument here is a rising plate meter. And then the handy pasture stick that many of us probably already have and use. So we're going to look at how both of these pieces of equipment can be used to measure dry matter and how they compare to each other. So I'll start with the rising plate meter, and this here is Larry actually using it in one of his pastures. As I mentioned, it's a computerized instrument that measures the forage height. And it does this by the plate that's there that rises up against the main rod as the amount of forage underneath will hold that plate up. And then inside the computer, there is a regression equation that basically converts that height reading into dry matter per acre. But the challenge is that equation must be relevant. This instrument was developed and used first in New Zealand, and they developed a lot of different regression equations for different areas of the island, for different months of the year, and for different species of grass, so that when we use that instrument, we would predictably know the amount of dry matter that was there. So that's the challenge here, is we've got the piece of equipment, but we needed to find out what equation did we need in there to convert that height reading into dry matter. So that once that is done, we can download the data into the computer. And what the beauty of this instrument is it allows for very rapid collection of dry matter on every pasture on your farm by simply walking through each pasture and recording the height, and it's automatically converted. So what is the methodology that I used here on Larry's farm? So in each pasture, we collected 3 clips, and so you can see here there's this sample frame that I throw down, which is of a known area, and then I use clippers, and I clip everything down to the ground level and place it into the bucket. And then I take some, what's called officially, the official term is plonk, which is a lovely term. So I take some plonks with the plate meter around this area where I collected the sample. And then I take the forage back home and I weigh it and I dry it in a Coster tester. And then I have a weight of a dry matter, of the weight of the forage on a dry matter basis for a known area. And then I can convert using math that information into dry matter per acre. And so each time I do this, I create a data point. And if I then put those data points onto a graph, I can eventually create a regression equation for those data points that I can then enter back into the computer. And now the piece of equipment is ready to take multiple readings on multiple pasture areas rather quickly. So that's what we did to create. And I'm going to show you some of those regression equations. So in here in the upper left, the first week, we collected 6 different samples. So each one of these blue dots is a location in one of 2 fields on the farm. And then we created a regression equation. And it tells you, maybe you can think back to your high school math, and there was this idea of y equals mx plus b. That's essentially what this is here. It's a description of this line that goes here. So if you take your height in centimeters, multiply it by 75.303 and add 375, which is where this line would cross the vertical axis, you would come up with an estimate. So after 2 weeks of data, we had this set. After 3 weeks of data, we had this. So there's an additional number here called R squared, and that just gives us an idea of how good of a fit this equation is. And so ideally, we would love it to be above 0.7, but it's not always that case. But it's somewhat robust, the R squared that we got over time. And after 5 weeks, we had this equation here. So to just take a little closer look at this here, after 3 weeks, I then rounded the numbers to 62 and 401. And those were the numbers I actually entered back into the rising plate meter to then be able to go out and collect some readings on Larry's farm. So that's what essentially we did for 3 weeks. We collected data points and came up with this equation that we could enter into the rising plate meter that would then allow us to go back to that farm and very quickly get an estimate of dry matter in every pasture that we wanted to on that farm. So one of the other nice things about the rising plate meter is that it is a computer. You can connect it to your computer, your laptop or your desktop or whatever you have, and it'll create reports for you. And these are just examples of some of the reports that are there. And I unfortunately could not find the cord that would connect the rising plate meter to my computer. So I had to put all that data by hand into an Excel spreadsheet to essentially create a similar report. And it's a little bit easier here to read. And so I'll walk through what you see here on this slide. So on the right-hand side, you see an aerial photo of Larry's farm. And you can see delineated in red all the different areas that he pastures animals. And then within some of the areas are these numbers like E8 or E26. The data we collected each week was from field E23 and E26. So each week we collected 3 samples in each of those areas to create the regression equation. So then we went out there and we took readings in these 5 fields. And these are the results there. So the rising plate meter told us that field E10 on October 6th had roughly 1,850 pounds of dry matter. And E26 had somewhere around 1,700 or 1,750 all the way through. And I drew a red line here, and it's somewhat arbitrary. It could be up higher, it could be lower. It's going to really depend on your experience of how much dry matter or residual dry matter you want to leave in each pasture so that the plants can quickly recover, capture sunlight, and grow and get ready for another grazing. Or at this time of the year, we're getting ready for winter. So you can see here that we just did 5 fields and I've sorted them out, and a couple of the fields have a fair amount of dry matter that would be available for Larry to move into, and one, which is one we just left, was, he ate it fairly well and he left about 1,200 pounds, which I think is excellent. So hopefully that pasture will go into winter doing quite well. Move on to the pasture stick, and this is an instrument that most of you are probably quite familiar with. It's just simply a stick, and it measures pasture height. So here in the photo you can see that it's in this particular pasture, the height is, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 inches depending on where you want to say the average height is. And then the stick has 4 sides, and each side of the stick has a lot of information. If you look down on the bottom here, you can see there's some information that's basically a helpful tip. There's some information that can be used to estimate the amount of dry matter based on species in your pasture. Here, New York State just simply means, or NYS means, this stick was developed for New York State. Different states, different areas of the United States have different species of plants or different heights that are commonly grazed to, and the sticks are specific for those areas. So what's significant is that this stick allows you, through the use of a dot grid, to create an estimate of dry matter per inch, and then through a series of simple calculations, you can figure out both the available dry matter in your field and the total amount in the field. So I believe Larry has a really great video that's going to describe this, so I won't belabor it anymore, and I'll just basically let him talk about the methodology in his video. So Larry shared with me the results of his pasture stick readings, and we have 2 different fields here, field 1 and field 2. Field 1 had just recently been grazed just prior to August 18th, and the other field was one that we thought was much further along and would be grazed in the future. And I don't know if Larry has started grazing it yet or not. He'll probably tell you. And then we took the average height. So these were the heights that we got each of the 3 weeks. And I want to remind you that each one of these rows represents 3 different samples, and they were averaged. So this is each row is an average of 3 collections. The average dots was 9, which would mean that there wasn't much forage there. And when we get down to 1.7, that means there was a fair amount of forage. And when you use the stick, you could barely see the dot grid. And then based on that, these were the estimates of dry matter per inch that Larry calculated, and the total amount of dry matter available for grazing. So this represents the amount that if you put animals in there, you could reasonably remove through grazing that amount and then leave that pasture, leaving enough there for the plant to recover and grow again. And the total amount of dry matter represents the total amount. So this is what would allow me to compare the pasture stick reading to the readings that I collected with the rising plate meter. And so you can see in the area where we just grazed, there wasn't much dry matter there. And in the other field, there was a fair amount of dry matter. So here we have the comparison, and again, let me show you. The blue is the pasture stick, the orange is the rising plate meter. And so we had August 18th, we had a pasture stick reading and a rising plate meter reading. Each one of these represents the average of 3 samples, and we had this in field 1 and field 2. And so on August 25th, we had our 2 fields again, and September 1st. And you can see by looking at the areas where it was recently grazed, there was not a good correlation between, but especially when you look at the field 2s in August 25th and September 1st, these bars are pretty close to each other. And so I feel like the stick did a reasonable job of estimating dry matter. So this is my concluding slide here to talk about this little research project. So we're going to compare the rising plate meter and the pasture stick. The rising plate meter, it's expensive. My recollection is that that instrument costs $700. Where the pasture stick is inexpensive. We still have some available in our office that we can give away for free. The challenge with the rising plate meter is that it needs to be calibrated to your situation in your area. So that's one of the things that I'm doing, and I will continue to do in the coming years, is to get more and more equations so that I can come out to your farm and hopefully say, okay, based on the conditions that I see here, let's use this equation and let's do a dry matter reading of every pasture on your farm. We could probably do that in a half an hour, depending on how many different pastures you have and how large your farm is. The challenge with the pasture stick is you need to know the grass species, because each grass species has its own set of numbers that you use to calculate or estimate the dry matter. The rising plate meter is rather time consuming to calibrate, but once it's calibrated, it's a pretty fast result that you can get. And it's a fantastic instrument once you get it ready to use. The pasture stick is somewhat time consuming to use every time you use it. And what I found is that the correlation was quite good in taller pasture. So if you're looking and trying to get an idea of what all your pastures, each paddock in your pasture system has for dry matter, for those that have 5-6 inches of grass or more, the pasture stick is probably going to give you a pretty reasonable estimate of how much is out there. It is not particularly good at estimating the amount of residual that's left after you eat. I think for that, just going back to the clipping, like I showed you where I had the sample frame and using the snips and cutting down to the ground surface, is probably the best way to get an accurate estimate of residual. That is what I have for the comparison. We'll go back, I'll stop sharing, and I would be happy to ask or answer any questions.
Hey, Rich, this is Dan Bredenberg.
Hi.
What was your opinion on? I was just thinking that it seemed like those pastures that were so short. It seems like the plate meter was it overestimating? It didn't seem like there could be that much dry matter available on something that was only 3 inches tall, or have such a discrepancy there. What was your take on the difference there?
The actual readings you saw for dry matter were based off of the sample frame. So the sample frame said that, yes, there is indeed that much there. So in the case of Larry's pasture, I think he has a fairly thick sward of grasses with not a lot of open spots. And so there's a fair amount of dry matter that was there. So those numbers that you saw were real numbers based off of actually physically clipping the pasture down to the ground surface and then weighing it.
And on Rich, when you did your clipping, you clipped right down to the surface. You didn't leave, it wasn't like a 4-inch stubble like we would do when we're hay sampling.
That is correct. I wanted to know the total amount of dry matter, so I clipped as close as I could to the surface of the soil to get that estimate. Yeah, so if the sample frame that I used actually has legs, and you can sample at a uniform higher height if you're looking for an estimate of available dry matter, for example.
Yeah, I was going to say, Rich, that I use the same metal frame, and that's what I'll usually do is more measure to the top of that, cut to the top of that frame. Except for when, like this time of year right now, I am cutting essentially down to the surface just because even the animals are grazing down there on some of the farms I'm at.
Thank you, Tatiana, for that. And I clip down to the surface because I want an actual estimate of the total dry matter. And that's why I do it. I'm using the tool to find out the total amount there, not the amount that's necessarily available for the animal to eat or what I would want the animal to eat. So that's why in this particular instance, I use it in that way. But if I were wanting to use that as an estimate of the amount of available, then I would be cutting maybe at a different height.
Could that be some of the discrepancy between it and the pasture stick though?
I don't think so. The pasture stick, the challenge is that it's using an estimate of density, and when they've just grazed and you're down at a 3-inch height, you're going to see essentially all the dots, and so it just doesn't really do well in my experience at that height. Most of the instructions on the stick are to help you find the available dry matter that's there. And so most often you would be using the stick in an area that you are considering turning the animals into. And then I think it works fairly well. So we did have in the chat a question about where do you take the height measurement, at the height of the highest blades or the height where the canopy density is at a certain level? That's a really good question, and I don't have a really good answer to that. I think that's one of the challenges that we had, and Larry might talk about this a little bit when we, is to figure out where that is, because, you know, as you get higher in the canopy, the density of the plants does change, and there isn't a uniform amount of dry matter in each inch of the canopy. It is variable, and the quality is also variable. You know, I think about the rising plate meter, and it tries to even that out because it's the plate itself is free floating, and it settles at an area where it's a combination of density and material that stops gravity from bringing the plate further down. And so I think there's a little bit of art to trying to figure out how to read your height on your pasture stick to correlate well with the calculations that are on that stick.
Wouldn't the calibration of the plate meter change from month to month through the season?
Yes, it absolutely does. And I mentioned that in New Zealand, they have, for each month of the grazing season, they have separate regression equations that they enter. And for the species composition, they have a separate regression equation. I think that's one of the reasons why I lost a little bit of robustness in my R² value, is that my last readings were after we had frosts, and they were much later in the year, and the plants were no longer actively growing. And, you know, they probably ideally would have a separate equation, regression equation to enter for that instance. That's the biggest challenge with this, is that it takes a lot of understanding and data points to get what you think is a robust equation that's going to do a good job of predicting. So the equation I would use, we use this instrument in other years, and when there was seed heads, the plate meter didn't work at all. It really needed a softer grasp because it relies on that combination of density and softness of the grass to come to its final resting level.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. All right, well, it's good to be with you this evening and talk a little bit about our farm here, Diane, and my farm. And here you can see a picture of the sheep. We've essentially got about 19 Romney sheep, about 9 goats, Angora goats, 2 cows, a pony, 2 rescue race horses, and about 100 chickens for eggs. So we are somewhat diversified in that respect, but we're mostly interested in really the chickens for the eggs, and also the sheep and sheep for wool. We also have a fiber studio. My wife's got a fiber studio in one of the barns, and so we're taking the wool from the sheep through the processing, and then right on through to making yarn, and then producing products via the yarn. The other aspect, the other thing that we have is a bed and breakfast, and the sheep and the goats really actually are an integral part of that bed and breakfast. And you can see the sheep and the goats here. I have a little video. I'm teaching a intro to soils course at SUNY Cobleskill this semester. And I showed the students just this quick video on the sheep. So we'll try this and see if this works. There we go. Well, good afternoon. So you might like to say hello to the sheep and goats here on the farm before we get started today. We do a rotational system of grazing here, and today they happen to be in the paddock right by the house. And as you can see, they do make pretty effective lawn mowers. So our guests really enjoy sitting on the back porch, and they are about this close to the sheep and the goats. And there's nothing more relaxing for them and for us when they're not here to sit out there and have some dinner and just be with the sheep and the goats and watch them and be with them. It's a very enjoyable time, a very relaxing time, and the guests really enjoy that. Well, here is the farm, and I'm going to get a pointer up. And Rich showed you the various paddocks that we use on the farm. And so let me just jump into the soils map. Here's a soils map of the farm. We've got some Lou Beach soil here. That's typically a well-drained soil. The Vly soil here. That's a shallower soil, potentially droughty sometimes. And you can actually take on the web soil survey, you can look at an estimate of what the animal unit months are going to be. And so you see here in our Lou Beach soil, for example, they're estimating anywhere from 8 to 9 animal unit months. And the animal unit month, it turns out to be about 780 pounds of forage produced in a month. So if we have 8 animal units, that means for the year, we're looking at maybe 5,600 pounds of forage, dry matter coming off of this particular field. On the Vly soil over in here, you can see that drops down quite a bit from about 3 to 5. So I use this just as a ballpark estimate of what the amount of forage might be as we move into these different pastures and look at the different soils associated with those pastures. So here's the map that you saw, and my identification numbers on the different pastures here are simply the acreages. That's how I identify them. You do see some strips in here. We have grown vegetables, have grown some field crops in here, but we're actually turning this entire area here into pasture now. So here's a little video that I put together on how I use the pasture stick. So we're out here in one of my pastures, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to estimate the number of pounds of dry matter that I have in this pasture that's going to be available for the sheep and the goats. And to do that, I'm going to use this pasture stick. It was developed by NRCS. And on the stick here, we've got a ruler with inches on it, and also there's some dots on here that when I look down onto the sward of grass, I can estimate the number of dots that I see, and that's going to translate into an estimate of the number of pounds of dry matter per acre inch. So let me get an estimate of the height of the grass. Looks like it's about 7 inches tall. So now I'm going to slip the pasture stick underneath the sward, and I'm going to look at these dots on here, look straight down and try and count the number of dots that I see. So I see 3 dots. And let me bring the pasture stick up close to the camera here, and hopefully you'll be able to see a little bit better what I'm talking about here. So here you can see the dots that I was looking down on, and based on the number of dots that I see, I can roughly determine the number of pounds of dry matter that we have. So you can see here, if we have 0 to 1 dot, I'm going to look down this column. If we have 1 to 2 dots right here, I'm going to look down that column. And if we have 3 or more dots, I'm going to look down the last column here. And each one of the different species of grasses and mixes is listed here on the stick, as you can see right over in here. So if I had, for example, here, if I'm looking at orchard grass and clover, that's the top one, and I was looking at those 3 dots, so I'm over here in this column right here, and I'm looking at 150 to 200 pounds per acre inch of dry matter. So that's what I would use then in order to try to calculate how many pounds of dry matter I'm going to have for the sheep and the goats. Now I had 7 inches. Now I don't want to take all 7 inches in terms of having them eat that down. So I might take 3 inches of that. So I multiply my 3 inches of forage times my 150 pounds or 200 pounds. And so I'd say I'd have 600 pounds per acre here of forage, that dry matter that the sheep and the goats might be able to utilize. So that's essentially what I do in terms of trying to measure the amount of forage that I have and estimate the number of days that I can stay into a particular pasture. So then what I do is I just set up a spreadsheet that I can use to run that calculation. So here's my sheep. I got 19 sheep. Here's my goats. I've got 9 goats, a total of 28 animals. And I'm estimating their weight just using 100 pounds per animal. So there's my total pounds of the animals. And I'm using 3% body weight as an estimate for the amount of feed that they need. So I'm going to need 84 pounds of dry matter per day for my sheep and my goats in the pasture. So here's some of the different pastures. And again, this is the amount of acres that's present in those pastures. Again, I use a identifying number for the pasture that corresponds to the number of acres. So here's a height, 12 inches, let's say, and so I'm not going to use all 12. My available height here is going to be 8 because I'm going to keep 4 inches of height. So here off of the stick then is the dry matter per acre inch, some examples of different dry matters off of the pasture stick. And now I've calculated the total amount of dry matter that I have available in each one of those pastures. And then I can convert that into grazing days because I know I need 84 pounds per day, so I can convert that into grazing days. So it gives me an estimate of the number of days that I'm going to be spending in each of those pastures. Now, I still have to go out and look. You still have to go out and observe the pasture in order to determine when they need to move, but this certainly helps me in being able to think about where they're going to go next and how many days I'm going to have in each one of those individual pastures. So we're going to concentrate a little more fully on this one right here. And I'm going to show you some more pictures within that particular pasture area. So it doesn't look much like a pasture right there, but this was going to be, as I said, we grow some vegetables, and this is our vegetable area. And we've actually surrounded this particular field with deer fence in order to keep the deer out. So last fall, I planted rye in that field, and the intent was to come in and crimp the rye and then possibly no-till some vegetables in. It was really late this year. It was a cold spring for us here and really too late. So I just left the grasses and the legumes come back up in the pasture area. And actually I had seeded clover with the rye into this area also. And the way that I'm crimping, I don't have a crimper, but the way that I'm crimping is I have a cut ditioner that I use for my hay, and it's got a solid roller all across the bottom of the cut ditioner. So I just ran that through the rye, not running the PTO in the cut ditioner. I didn't want to mow the rye. I just wanted to crimp it down. So that's what the rye looks like after it was all crimped down. And this is what that pasture field looks like when we were ready to graze later this summer. I was really impressed, actually, with the way that that field then turned out. With that rye down as a cover, it was preventing weeds from coming up. It allowed the clover to come through very nicely, and also the grasses to come back through as well. So here you can see the sheep and the goats out here grazing in a portion of that pasture. They're just in this section here. and they've already grazed in this particular section. So coming back to the pasture area here, 0.8, what you're looking at here in this field is up in the upper left-hand corner. And what I'm going to do now is we're going to walk across the field. We're going to travel across the field with the sheep and the goats as they're grazing across the field. So this is what the field looks like as I'm moving across. I use netting to separate the areas. They've grazed in this area here, and they're ready to move over into this particular area here. And you can see the clover coming in there. We've got some orchard grass and fescue growing in there. And in order to calculate how much of a move I'm going to have here of the fence, I went back to my spreadsheet and calculated the number of actually square feet in a day that I needed for the sheep and the goats. And it turns out it's almost 1,500 square feet that I needed for this particular pasture using the pasture stick in estimating the amount of dry matter that's there. So the way that I did it then was I ran the gator up through here so that I could move my fence over and have some good contact in terms of the electric. So there you see the gator going up through. This is what it looked like after I'm ready now to move the fence. And now this paddock is set up for the sheep and the goats to come in. You'll notice I didn't use a back fence, and it would be better if I had a back fence in there, but I do like to leave the sheep and the goats move out off of this area. I was a little concerned about the amount of clover that I had in there, that it might be too much clover in there, and I was worried a little bit about bloat. So I wanted them to be able to move into other areas that they actually had already grazed in order to try and prevent that from happening and not have them locked into just this particular area. So here they are, they've come in. Obviously they know where the good stuff is. They concentrate in that particular area, and they'll graze in there for an hour, 2 hours, and then they'll move off of that. Now, we bring our sheep and goats in every night, and then we take them out every morning. So they're not out there 24 hours. They're only out there during the day, during the daylight hours. So here you can see them grazing, just a broader shot to show the rest of the area where they already have grazed. And this is down in another pasture area that's open to them. They can come out through, there's an opening in the fence. The gates are actually over here. So they can walk over there. Here you can see the electric fence where they were grazing. So they've decided to come out, they go over to the gate, and then they come down into this pasture here because there's shade. They like to come down to the shade, and that's where I have their water too. I take water out to them each day, take about 9 or 10 gallons of water in the morning, and if it's a hot day, I go back out at noontime and refill their water room. Again, one of the things that, as I said, I was concerned about was the amount of clover. And as we travel through the field in this direction, the clover percentage kept increasing and increasing. So I started them off in the portion of the field that had a much higher percentage of grass and a lower percentage of clover. And as we came through here, the amount of clover was increasing. But what was interesting is that they would graze for a period of time, and then they'd move off of that. And here you can see some of the sheep over here. They've moved off into a different area. This area had some taller grass in. They've come through the gates here that are open, and they'd be grazing in this area. And maybe they'd come on down, get a drink of water, rest in the shade a little bit if it was a hot day. And then in the afternoon, they'd all head on back, and they'd graze some more in that particular paddock. And this was interesting to me from the standpoint of the concept of this idea of natural wisdom that these animals have. Fred Presenz's presentation that he gave, which was very interesting. And they seem to hopefully self-regulate and I had no problems. I didn't have any trouble with any bloat issues at all with them. Well, some of the other issues that we have on the farm here, in order to get over to these two fields here, you can see a pond in here, and there's actually a stream that flows through the farm right in through here. So we have to cross through the wetland area and the stream, and we're looking for a way to not have to do that. And here's what that wetland looks like. I mean, it looks beautiful in the summertime. The sheep and the goats are crossing over in this area here, so we fence out as much of that wetland area as we can in order to protect it. So I'm hoping to be able to work out a different pathway for them, but we do need to get over here because these are two large areas that we do want to graze. As I said, we have two rescue race horses, and this particular field here is this one. So I hayed half of that field, the upper part of the field, and the sheep had grazed this area in the field. And I do like to let the horses in and allow them to have some exercise and run. Typically the horses are in this area in through here, but I do let them into this particular field here, pasture, and leave them have a nice time to be able to run around. I'll pull them off pretty soon. I'll pull them off so that they don't eat that section down and damage the storage areas on those grasses, so that this will recover hopefully very nicely next year. And normally it does recover pretty well. Just a couple other little tidbits. In this particular field, one of the things that I did when I sampled the field, I sampled areas that had no manure on it from the animals, and I sampled under a manure patty. And this was under mainly the horse manure patty. And organic matter content, you can see the difference in the organic matter under the manure versus no manure. The cation exchange capacity, pretty much the same, a little bit higher under the manure. The difference in pH, a little bit higher, zinc, a little higher, copper, a little higher. And the base saturation was higher too. Base saturation, of course, is the amount of calcium, magnesium, potassium that's adsorbed onto the soil colloids there. So I just thought that was interesting information about what happens when we allow the manure to work its way back into the soil. We also compost. We compost all of our livestock manure. And so I did a video of the composting operation. Now, this was actually for my class, and we were in a discussion about soil air. So you're going to hear more about soil air, but you're also going to hear about what we do in terms of composting. Right here at our compost site here on the farm, we compost all of the livestock manure, the sheep and goat manure, and we got a couple cows, we compost that. And any of the yard waste and vegetable waste that we have, we compost that as well. You can see some of the windrows behind me, and what we do is we take a manure spreader and we load the manure spreader, and then we run the manure spreader down and build these windrows for the compost. We've been talking about soil air, and one of the important things about soil air is the porosity in the soil and the ability to replace carbon dioxide with oxygen for microbial activity. And that's really what we're doing with the compost here as well. I put a thermometer in. And right now, we're up to 118 degrees in that compost pile. Last night, the temperature here was 26 degrees. So it's the microbial activity in there that's generating the heat. And the same thing occurs in the soil. Microbial activity in an aerobic environment takes that organic material plus oxygen, the microbes breaking down the organic material and converting it into carbon dioxide and water. So what we're going to see is about a 50% reduction in the size of this windrow, the height of the windrow and the width of the windrow. And that's because that carbonaceous material is being broken down and converted into CO2. And that's what's happening in the soil also. Same thing, just not as rapid. Because remember, the oxygen content in the soil might be 10 or 15% as opposed to 21, 22% out here in the atmosphere. Plus, when we aerate the piles here, these compost piles, we oxidize that organic matter. Well, it turns out that we do the same thing in the soil. When we till up the soil, we increase the macroporosity, we get the oxygen in there, and then those microbes go to work because now they have a lot of oxygen and they break down the organic matter in the soil. So a constant tillage operation will lower the organic matter content in the soil. Now, the disadvantage, of course, of compost here is that CO2, where's it going to go? It's going to go up into the atmosphere. In the soil, it's going to be trapped to a certain extent, but it's still going to go into the atmosphere. But we can sequester a tremendous amount of carbon in the soil because of all the root growth that's occurring within the soil when we have vegetative cover over the surface. So that's how we sequester that carbon into the soil. So an aerobic environment, remember, within the soil, as within our compost, that organic material, C6H12O6, that organic material gets broken down with oxygen. That's the microbes. The microbes need the oxygen. They break it down and they convert that C6H12O6, they convert that into CO2 and water. Okay, well, that's a quick look at some of the things that we do on the farm here. And I'll be happy to try to answer any questions and turn it back over to Rich.
So Larry, in your videos, you didn't have any back fence. Do you ever use a back fence, or how many days would you go before you put in a back fence?
I did not use any back fence this year. I think I will in the past, and probably what I would do is for instance, in the field that you saw, I'd probably move 3 or 4 days worth of area that had already been grazed and maybe put the back fence in there. Because there was still a fair amount of forage in those fields or those paddocks that they had grazed as we moved down through into the fresh forage and less further on down. And so I not allow them to go all the way back to the beginning. But I do like to give them a little extra room in there to move around and share that forage. Now in the other paddocks, the other pastures, there's not nearly the amount of clover in those. So in those, I basically leave them in there. They're generally smaller. And that big field, that 3.4 acre field, that one I do split up and put them in sections in that field. But it's just handy for me to know, okay, I'm going to be in there for 4 days, probably, or 5 days, probably, or 3 days, probably. So those, I don't think I really need the back fence, but I will need, as we move forward, I think I will need the back fence in the field that you saw tonight, the one that we concentrated on there. Yeah.
So I'm also curious on the rye that you rolled down.
Yeah.
The clover just grew up through that. You rolled the rye down, and did you do anything to remove any of that rye?
No. That's what was really interesting. Yeah, the clover germinated in the fall with the rye, and it wasn't very tall. It was kind of small at that point. And then when I crimped the rye, then it started to come through, work its way through the rye mulch right up, and I got a good stand.
Yeah. Okay, so we do have a question for you in the chat. Says, Larry, what do you do if the pasture gets too mature and ahead of your animals?
Well, either make hay out of it or move them on and then clip it. That's typically what I'll do with it. Yeah.
Where are you able to have a pretty good rotation? I know I've heard Rich talk about the length of rotation for small ruminants, especially for parasite control. Are you able to effectively have a good long rotation with your land base to prevent parasite issues or mitigate a little bit?
That's one of the reasons that we're stopping the vegetable production on a broader scale up in that field. And also I had some small grains up there, even had some corn up there at one time. And we're going back to pasture so that I can do that. I really couldn't with the limited number of fields available before we decided to just go ahead and use that whole field. Now I think I will be able to.
Larry, you mentioned that you bring them back to the barn each night. Could you talk about why you do that? What went behind your decision there?
Yeah, the main reason on that is the predators. My wife Diane's very afraid of predators. Really likes the sheep and the goats, so we bring them back in for that reason. Now we're producing wool, so if it rains, they don't go out because we don't want that wool to get all wet. And that's sort of another reason we'll have a little bit better control over keeping that wool cleaner by just leaving them out probably during the day. But it's mainly for predators. I know, Kim, when you had said about your electric fences and the charge that you're getting, like 5.2, I've only been able to, on mine, I can get up to about 3.5 and that's it. So I certainly, at 5, I think you keep those coyotes out. I'm a little concerned about 3, 2.5, that kind of thing with our animals, because around us, usually every night during the summertime, we hear the coyotes. They're all around us.
Larry, are you calculating for all the species that are grazing, and are you doing a rotational follow with the horses and the chickens?
No, we're not at this point. I'm just calculating for the sheep and the goats. Yeah, the chickens have an area that is adjacent to the chicken house, but we don't follow them. We don't follow the sheep and the goats with the chickens. I don't have a way to do that at this point yet. We have one chicken house where the chickens live, and it's not mobile. It's not movable. It's the old chicken house that was with the farm for a very long time. So we use that, but open up a paddocked area around that chicken house behind it where the chickens go out. So they also come in every night. You know, we bring them in, open it up in the morning, let them out, and then they all go back and feed them, and then they all go back in the evening, and then I close them up at night too.
Are you using the horses, especially for barber pole worm?
We are not. And I got to tell you, I'm not a livestock expert person on any of this, so you go ahead and explain what you said about that particular worm.
We've been trying to sort out the same issues is how to graze with the horses, with the chickens, and with the small ruminants.
Uh-huh.
And part of the recommendation we had gotten had to do with parasite control, but then also trying to manage the forage itself. So I was just curious if you were having any luck moving between the same, because we share the same species. So I was just curious if you had any of it.
Yeah.
I appreciate your watching the animals and seeing what they do. I only have 20 sheep, ewes and lambs, and I love watching how they choose to go to certain areas on their own. And I have my barn kind of in the middle, and so they always have access to it if they want to feel safe at night, and they're always in there at night.
Are they? Yeah.
Yeah. And so I just find it fascinating to watch when they feel comfortable being out, what they're doing, and
Yeah.
you know, it's just fun to watch their natural habit. You know, so I appreciate what you do with them.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, yeah. And our guests love it to watch them, and you know, a lot of our guests have children And the children, our sheep and goats are very docile. So we do let them go in. They don't play in there with them. They're supervised in there, but a lot of them have never seen sheep or goats, especially up that close before.
Larry, could you talk just a little bit more about how you composting those windrows of manure and how you incorporate that back into the soil then?
Okay. And actually, one of the things that we do is after the sheep are sheared, what's left over that we're not going to send to the mill, that goes into the compost as well. I forgot to mention that. Well, once that compost pile is complete and finished, then we'll use that and just spread that over the surface and allow that to then move back down into the soil. So it's a stable material at that point, and it's been used mostly in our vegetable production when we were producing vegetables. And we've scaled that way back. We have a small greenhouse that we put up, so we do a blend using the compost. And I'm going to have a fair amount now, as you saw those windrows, those two larger windrows. So we will spread that over I'll spread that over the pastures in order to provide some additional fertility. And our pastures are pretty acid. So the organic matter, especially the stable organic matter coming out of the compost, hopefully that's going to tie up the aluminum that's there that's causing our acidity. It's going to tie some of that up, and that's going to help in terms of increasing the growth of the forage as well, to prevent that aluminum toxicity. You know, there's some thoughts out there that in terms of pH, that the critical thing in the realm of pH is, to a certain extent, the aluminum content that's in the soil, because it's the aluminum that drives the pH, but it's the aluminum that's toxic to the plants. So stable organic material like that compost, at least theoretically, will tie up that aluminum and not allow it to reach levels, hopefully, that are a problem.
This is Tatiana.
Yes.
Talking about, you know, how to manage your horses and with your sheep and stuff. And I know that at our farm, what we do is most of the time the horses follow about 4 to 6 weeks behind the sheep, the goats. And that way at about, you know, when the barber pole worm larvae have peaked at about 35 days, 28 to 35 days after the goats have moved out of an area, are in there grazing it. And since they don't get infected by the same species of barber pole worm, they're able to vacuum up those worm eggs. Earlier in the season, of course, we more have the horses go out to some of our farther pastures to graze, so those pastures don't get hopefully too tall before the goats can get out to those pastures.
So Larry, are there other sort of pasture related practices that you do that sort of are unique to your fiber quality? You know, are you selecting animals for particular kinds of fleece, or you know, just interested in what practices you're doing for quality fleece?
Mainly it's the nutrition that we're concerned about, just to keep them healthy. They're mostly Romneys. My wife knows more about that than I do in that respect, but she decided that that's the type of sheep that she wanted for the fleece that they produce, plus the Angora, to do a blend of those two. And we're just you know, it's a learning curve. We're just learning about this, and just trying to keep them healthy is what I'm trying to do with the pastures, and keep the soil healthy. Have a good stand in the grass, healthy soil, healthy sheep, producing healthy wool to make nice clothing and products out of that.
Yeah.
So.
Larry, thank you so much for sharing what you did with us tonight. And thank you everyone for attending and asking so many questions of our farmers.